Okay, so I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Strasberg. Now, Jonathan, we were here 4 years ago, weren't we, at Birmingham Airport? And again, really interesting times. And so Jonathan is MD of True Course Law, US attorney, and I'm sure we're in for some interesting insight from you now, Jonathan.
Well, I remember that time 4 years ago. I walked into that room feeling like I had been hit by a bus. Everybody else looked the same. And to be honest, I'm probably one of those 55% that Harry was referring to. Here we are, the morning after the most important presidential election in living memory. We may not know the actual outcome for several days. Meanwhile, the country sits on the edge of panic, wondering whether it's still a full democracy, especially with Donald Trump's premature claim to having won. The election takes place in the backdrop of widespread voter suppression by those very same states that were the raison d'etre of the 1965 Voting Act. Regrettably, that act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 2013 on the basis that it was no longer necessary, in one of the most unjustifiably and brazen political decisions in recent history, matched only by the court's decision 3 years earlier in the case of Citizens United, which held that corporations are, for matters of free speech and political contributions, people just like you and me, people who need to feed and educate their children, live in safe communities, and have access to medical care. It's interesting to note that since the Voting Rights Act was struck down as unnecessary, over 1,200 polling places in minority districts in various states have been removed, many of them, as we know, in anticipation of this election. I'm inspired by the people that queued 11 hours or more for early voting, producing votes totaling about 96 million, smashing prior records, and in some states surpassing the total votes cast in the 2016 election. The entire country, and for that matter, the world, agree about how important this election is. But what so many people are mystified by is how we got here. Some would say that Trump is an anomaly that has to be removed, after which we can return to more normal and healthy American democracy. I don't think that's correct. Some would say that it's a response to unresolved economic and social fallout from the double gut punch of the financial crisis and globalization. While I'd agree that together these are immediate causes, the financial crisis and globalization have their roots in deeper structural problems in the American democracy. And in that respect, they're as much symptoms as is Trump himself. Finally, some would say that it's just the continued march of a growing radical right in America since the presidency of Ronald Reagan. But that only begs the question of what permitted such a march to actually reach the doorstep of what some people fear might be fascism. For me, the answer can be distilled down to three awful decisions made over the course of the past few decades. Decisions that have led the way for America to move from a country with a government by, for, and of the people to one very, very close to being by, for, and of a corporate oligarchy. The first awful decision under the presidency of Ronald Reagan was his administration's repeal of a law called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine required that all broadcast news must give fair time to opposing views in politics. After its repeal, broadcast news increasingly devolved from being a public service to becoming entertainment and a source of advertising revenue. The Fairness Doctrine was more than just a law. It was a cultural proclamation that we are a country that valued educated voters and information that they rely upon, and that the people who dispense that information must be accountable to the truth and thereby the welfare of the nation as a whole. In a country like America, with huge swaths of rural, poor, uneducated people, and people often biased along racial, cultural, religious, and nationalist lines, repeal of the Fairness Doctrine and the cultural values it represented paved the way for disaster. An old friend once expressed what sounded to me at the time like an absurd opinion, but I think it has withstood the test of time. He said that American culture is comprised of two things: popular culture and the Bill of Rights, meaning individual rights. The absence of the Fairness Doctrine left American broadcast media to the mercy of the commercial demands of popular culture. News went from being an examination of political affairs, requiring some level of focus and attention, to being a series of loud, colorful, brash, easy to swallow sound bites, requiring a bare minimum of Are you there? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we've got you back. Thanks,
Okay,
Jonathan.
something went funny there. I was cut off for a moment.
Don't
I
worry,
thought Donald
carry
Trump heard
on.
my speech.
Carry on with your awful decisions made in the last
Right.
decades.
Well, news went from being an examination of political affairs requiring some level of focus and attention to being a series of loud, colorful, brash sound bites. And slowly but surely, the object of broadcast news became the financial benefit of media conglomerates rather than an educated and discerning voting populace. For mainstream media, it was far better that Americans be passive consumers than critical thinkers. And as a result, America over the past 30 years has been a country with a large portion of its citizenry, possibly the majority, unaware of the workings of their own economic and political system, far less those of any other country. And ultimately, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine gave cultural, if not strictly legal permission for the existence of Fox News, the apex of right-wing popular culture. The second awful decision has already been mentioned, the Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United, which essentially allowed unlimited amounts of dark, unaccounted for money to flow from corporations and the richest amongst us to party political action committees, known as PACs or super PACs, which essentially campaign for the policies of particular candidates. Now, campaign finance in the US has always attracted legitimate criticism, but Citizens United opened the floodgates of money to completely opaque sources. Before the decision in 2006, dark money contributions totaled less than $5 million. By 2012, that figure increased to $300 million. In the top 10 most competitive Senate races in 2014, more than 71% of outside spending was dark money with no sources revealed. From the year of the court's decision in 2010 to 2018, $2.9 billion was spent on the federal election. And that brings us to this election. In 2020, the presidential race alone is expected to cost a total of $6.6 billion. And when you add in the Senate races and the House races as well, it tops a whopping $14 billion. The bulk of super PAC money comes from just a few wealthy donors. A horrible fact, for example, is that in the 2018 election, which was not for president, it was for the legislature, the top 100 donors to super PACs contributed nearly 78% of all super PAC spending. The question of whether members of Congress are more loyal to their donors than to their constituents or the welfare of the country is very real, very under-addressed one, and has resulted in many Americans feeling that their votes simply don't count. When we look at the issues like gun control, especially in light of what's happening right now, that impression is most certainly borne out. In addition, because the sources of funds are unknown, it need not be Americans making those contributions. The source can be anyone from any country with any agenda. And yes, that includes foreign actors who have an interest in undermining Western alliances. And finally, the third of the awful trio is gerrymandering. This is a practice whereby voting districts are drawn in such a manner as to fatally dilute the votes of supporters of the opposing party, rendering those votes ineffectual. It's a process that turns democracy on its head. Instead of voters choosing their candidates, the candidates choose their voters. And while both parties are guilty, 4 times as many districts are tilted to Republicans than to Democrats. And this has 2 main effects. It makes congressional incumbents almost unchallengeable, and it inhibits cross-party cooperation. Ultimately, it causes political polarization. By some estimates, gerrymandering disenfranchises about 42 million voters, an amount equal to the combined populations of America's 22 smallest states. And as a side note, hardly a side note, more central note, in 2020, this past year, the Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering is unconstitutional if it's done with a racist objective. Fair enough. But perfectly constitutional if it's done for political advantage. In other words, if you use the correct label, you are free to disenfranchise whichever American voters you wish. These 3 awful decisions over the past few decades have been at the root of a slow and steady degradation of American democracy, a steady degradation that has been underreported in mainstream press in a manner I find almost criminally negligent. By the time of the 2016 election, of which this 2020 election is part 2, American democracy was far less healthy than it appeared. Like an immunocompromised medical patient, many of the popular vital signs were good. The Dow was up, unemployment was low, consumer confidence was high. But the inner workings, those indicia of political and economic health that are too boring for a revenue-driven 24-hour news cycle, were abysmal. And America was much weaker than it looked. Wealth disparity had reached truly horrific proportions. Wall Street had become an inverse reflection of Main Street. So long as the Dow remained high, it didn't matter that multiple generations in great swaths of rural America were left to wither into hopelessness. America became officially recognized as a very flawed democracy with the lowest level of social mobility of any developed democracy and a huge opioid crisis to boot. Excuse me. Like any other immunocompromised patient, America was highly susceptible to opportunistic parasites. And enter, of course, Donald Trump. History may forever argue about what Hillary Clinton and the Democrats did or didn't do to lose the 2016 election. But just as importantly is the question of what Donald Trump did to not only win the election, but maintain an unwavering loyalty of his base through 4 years of a presidency that undermined not just the country, but the well-being of the very base that supports him. In my view, what Trump did and the mainstream Democratic Party did not do was speak the one fundamental truth required to gain the trust of the tens of millions of those left behind, marginalized, and forgotten in rural and much of suburban America. The one fundamental truth that the country's political and economic system was broken. Trump spoke it over and over again in a variety of ways. And so long as he did, he acquired the license to campaign with a sort of lies, manipulation, hate, and self-service that appealed to the darkest impulses of that 30% of the electorate. The lies didn't matter, the manipulation didn't matter. All that mattered was that he identified with their pain and alienation. He spoke their language. They didn't feel patronized. And very importantly, he was happy to hate whoever they hated. These past few years, it is absolutely no coincidence that the surge in overt racism was particularly acute following 8 years of a successful presidency by an African American. When Trump set about unraveling one by one successive Obama's achievements, he wasn't only indulging his own obsession. He was performing for his base, animating in real time the observation of Lyndon Johnson, who was John F. Kennedy's vice president and successor. His observation that if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. How ironic then that the feeding frenzy of ignorant scapegoating and deconstruction of democracy, truth, and civility, the unparalleled and open corruption, had all been let loose by the telling of a first fundamental truth, that America was broken. So this 2020 election is both part two of the 2016 election and a reckoning in and of itself. For the last few decades, much of America has slept through the degradation of its democracy. Finally and thankfully, it now seems that many have awakened. I don't know if they've awakened too late. For many people, it's as though the scourge of Trump came out of nowhere. Others, like me, feel that they've been watching it develop for years, wondering when the weight of corruption would finally tip the country into an open rather than latent struggle for its democratic life. So returning full circle to the beginning, none of us know what the next few days or weeks are going to bring, but as for me, I'm fairly certain about two things. First, until America fixes its campaign finance laws, redraws congressional districts in a fair manner, and makes laws to require responsible media, then no matter who occupies the Oval Office, the country will, over the long term, continue its slide away from democracy towards something worse and far more dangerous for its people and possibly the world. And the second point is that if they want to not just survive, but thrive in another election, the mainstream Democratic Party will also be forced to admit that democracy in America is broken. And when they do, they will have no choice but to seriously entertain proposed policies of their own progressive wing. Because I'm not sure I know of any other way to address the poverty, ignorance, and hatred of 30% of the marginalized and forgotten voters. Said another way, the Republican Party has nearly defeated democracy in America by calling upon and indulging the very worst of itself. And the Democratic Party can only rise to this challenge by calling on the very, very best of itself. And that's how I feel.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'm just thinking about your legal background. I mean, I've just checked in with the team here to see what the results looking like at the moment. So we've got Biden on 220, we've got Trump on 213. And Trump came out just before we went on air to say that, you know, we've won basically, and that the rest of the election would be fraudulent. So what are you thinking with your legal background, how that's going to play out now?
Well, he's already placed an illegitimate seat on the Supreme Court, and he's hoping that that placement was not allowed to rule on some of the counting of early votes or late voting after Election Day. But that may change, and she may be able to tip the balance, but that's unlikely. I'm not nearly expert enough in constitutional law to opine on that. But what I can say is Trump is laying the seeds for a practical win, for sowing chaos. He has a history of sowing as much chaos as possible and then trying to extract from that the best that he can. He is absolutely banking on the ignorance of America. He is absolutely banking upon the worst impulses of Americans. I think this is only partially a legal issue. The gun shops in America have sold out their stock 3 times over the past few months. 3 times they've emptied their shelves. There's actually a bullet shortage in America right now. Every city is boarded up. We are the home of the free and the brave, right? And we're about to find out whether we really are. I was raised being fed that we're the best country in the world. And none of us ever questioned that for most of our lives. And we so didn't question it that we didn't really pay attention to the news. We just watched sitcoms. And somehow we've been dumbed down. And I think it's a big wake-up call to Americans that they have to wake up and they need some information and they have to think critically. I was watching the BBC coverage this morning versus the CNN coverage. And it was like watching the difference between a serious news program and the Super Bowl coverage. I'm sorry to say. Anyway, I think it's partially a legal problem, but no, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen.
Okay.